Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Oppenheimer. I know it's been a few weeks since the last one, so yeah, I've been very busy recently, but I think this will be a very fun episode. We'll get back into it in just a second. Oh, I see the chat is misaligned for some reason in the live stream. Not sure why that is. I'll fix that real quick. Okay, there we go. So, again, feel free to leave any questions for me in the chat. I love answering questions about history and Oppenheimer. That's what we're here to talk about today. So feel free to leave those questions in the live chat. Also, today is a very exciting day because I just hit a big threshold for subscribers, 2 to the 11 or 2,048 subscribers. So I'm thinking I might do a special live stream tomorrow where I don't know, do something to celebrate that big milestone. I remember the last time that I reached one of these power of 2 milestones was 2 to the power of 10, 1,024 subscribers, and I made a special video for that one about the definition of a kilobyte and how computers store data, because 1,024 is very relevant to that. So I'll think of something and I might do something tomorrow. But yeah, so thank you all to the new subscribers and the old subscribers who have decided to tune in. I hope that you enjoy my live streams and my videos. Um, I am working on a couple new videos in the background while I work on these live streams. And I just really enjoy it. And I hope to continue to make videos and podcasts that people really like. So, with that all out of the way, let's get caught up on where we were from 3 weeks ago. So, last time we did the morning session of April 15th, 1954. Now we are in the afternoon session. So in the morning session, we had testimony from Leslie Groves, who's the general that was overseeing the Manhattan Project, and he gave sort of mixed testimony in terms of, good versus bad for Oppenheimer. He was basically saying like, yeah, today Oppenheimer, he's kind of a security risk, but like when I hired him, like all the scientists were kind of security risks. They pretty much summarized that in the movie in a pretty brief way. And mostly he's just trying to like, he was trying to sort of deflect some blame for some of the security failures at Los Alamos. So yeah, interesting testimony, kind of a mixed bag in terms of how much it helps Oppenheimer. But the afternoon session, I believe, is just going to be more cross-examination of Oppenheimer, if I remember correctly, or redirect, whichever one that we're on. But yeah, we'll just get started with that and talk about that. So yeah, that's about it, I think, for necessary context. So yeah, let's just get started. Oh yeah, I also added some color codes to everyone. So the people with a yellow name tag are, supposedly neutral. They are the judges. Then the red name tags are the prosecutors, and the blue are going to be the defense team. And the reason I did that is because, as you can see, there are a bunch of these lawyers down here that weren't depicted in the movie, but are on one side or another. And I thought it was probably a little confusing in the previous episodes when I would flip to one of these random lawyers and it's like, okay, who's this guy? What's he all about? So that's some added context. And the witnesses are going to continue to just have white name tags because you don't really know whose side they're on. So yellow is for counsel, red is for prosecutor, blue is for defense. So anyway, okay. And let's just make sure everything's good and ready to go. Okay, everything looks good, so I'll get going. Okay, the proceeding will begin. I would like to say, with respect to the proceedings today and tomorrow, I think we will go ahead with the questioning of Dr. Oppenheimer this afternoon as expeditiously as possible. We would like to finish, if we can, the questioning of Dr. Oppenheimer and then put on these three witnesses tomorrow that are going to be here. I understand that will be Colonel Lansdale, Mr. Glennon, and Dr. Compton. At the conclusion of their testimony, we will then begin what would be referred to as redirect examination. In this general connection, also, I express the hope that we can start at 9 o'clock in the morning. Then Garrison. I am sure that's possible. I think I would also like to say, Mr. Garrison, that I assume in a court that the general procedure would be that a judge would direct that the redirect examination proceed immediately upon the conclusion of the questioning on cross. However, in an effort to make sure we are giving every consideration possible to Dr. Oppenheimer and his counsel, we'll take these witnesses out of order. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe it to be in the discretion of even a trial judge to do that. I also understand that this is not a trial but an inquiry. That's right, sir. I have not been able to reach Colonel Lansdale yet. His plane is supposed to be arriving at 1:30. Then he has not been upset by any communication. May I proceed, Mr. Chairman? Yes. Whereupon J. Robert Oppenheimer, the witness on the stand at the time of taking the recess, resumed to the stand and testified further as follows. Cross-examination continued by Mr. Robb. Dr. Oppenheimer, would you refer to your letter of answer on page 11 where you say, after our marriage in 1940, my wife and I, for about 2 years, had much the same circle of friends as I had had before, mostly physicists and university people. Could you tell us, Dr. Oppenheimer, what names occur to you as your circle of friends during that period? Many. Ed Milliken, the first night we were back in Berkeley, we had dinner with the Lawrences. I had relatives there called the Sterns, whom I had brought over from Germany, the Hands, the Chevaliers, the Edward Tolmans, the Meikle-Johns, Jenkins. Is that David Jenkins? No, that is Francis Jenkins. I can go on and on. I just wondered whom you had in mind. This is not a bad example. The Addises. The Kenneth Mays? No, they were not close friends. I'm not trying to name all the people that we occasionally saw. Did your circle of friends include some communists or communist sympathizers? Oh, yes. Who were they? Let us see about friends. The Chevaliers I have mentioned, the Addises I have mentioned. Among communists, I don't think it would be right to call the Steve Nelsons friends, but we saw something of them. When they were acquaintances. We did see the Mays, at least Ken May. I don't know what we saw of his wife very much. Almost everybody in the physics department. The Hildebrands, the Peters, Latimer? Oh, wait. It's Dr. Evans. Latimer? We saw him, but he was not a personal friend. Just for clarity, the Stephen Peppers, when he said almost everybody in the physics department, would you determine whether he was referring to communists or communist sympathizers? No, not communists. I understood you to mean you saw almost everybody in the physics department. That's right. The record will show that the witness did not say that everybody in the physics department was a communist. That is right. The Peters. They were communists. I told you yesterday that they had no connection with the party. They were pretty close. I think they had no connection with the party at all. There was one name that I didn't get, and I don't know whether the reporter did either. Was it Hand? George Hand. Doctor, have you ever crossed anybody off your list or ceased to see them because of their Communist Party connections? I can't put it that way. Since the war, there are people with whom there has been a sense of hostility which I identified with their remaining close to the party. Who were those people? This happened with the Peters. It happened with a boy who was a doctor and a close friend of my brother's and used to spend summers at the ranch long ago. What's his name? If you need his name, I will give it to you. It is Roger Lewis. This is, in a sense, an estrangement, but it is not that I know they are members of the party and I no longer have anything to do with them. After the war, I did not wish to have anything to do with party people in California. You mentioned the different Jenkins. That is Miss Arnstein's present name, and I did not wish to see them, and I didn't. She is the Miss Arnstein you mentioned yesterday. Yes. Is she married to David Jenkins? Yes. How well do you know Jenkins? Not very well. Did you know him in 1943 and 44? 1944, certainly not. Did you know him in 1943? I met him, and I don't have any recollection of seeing him in 1943. But you knew Miss Arnstein at the time? From way back, yes. In what connection did you know her? I think I told you she was one of Jean Tatlock's best friends. Did you see David Jenkins and Miss Arnstein or Mrs. Jenkins after the war? No. What caused you to be estranged from her? This is an example of people in the party. I have been searching to answer your question. You have searched your memory carefully, and those are the names that come up? I'm not sure if I searched longer, I would find others. You say on the same page, quote, we were occasionally invited to more or less obviously left-wing affairs, Spanish relief parties, that still continued, end quote. Doctor, why were they obviously left-wing? If Schneiderman talked, they were obviously left-wing. The Spanish relief parties, I think, by then were obviously left-wing. What was there about them that indicated so clearly that they were left-wing? I suppose the presence of many of the people whose names I have told you. In other words, you felt that those people would not have been at a party unless it was pretty obviously left-wing. No, not at all. I don't think anybody would refuse to go to a party because it wasn't left-wing, but many people might refuse to go to a party if it were left-wing. You say on 2 occasions, quote, once in San Francisco and once in Berkeley, we attended social gatherings of apparently well-to-do people at which Schneiderman, an official of the Communist Party in California, attempted, not with success as far as we were concerned, to explain what the communist line was all about, end quote. Where were those parties held? One that I talked about yesterday was at the Chevalier's. One that I did not talk about yesterday was at Louise Branston's. Who is she? She lived in San Francisco. I think she was separated from her husband, had some money, and was a friend of Addis. I know very little about her, but I believe she was a communist sympathizer. Wasn't she a member of the Communist Party? If she was, I didn't know that. I didn't know anything about that. Did you ever hear that she was a mistress of a man named Kefitz, who was in the Russian consulate? No, I never heard that. How did you happen to meet Miss Branston? I don't remember. This party was held at her house? Yes. In the evening? Yes. How many people were present? It was similar to the one at the Chevalier's, 20 people. I don't have a clear distinction between the two in my mind. Can you recall about when that was? No, it was after our marriage because my wife was there. After 1940? I would say after the end of 1940. Subsequent, of course, to the Nazi-Soviet pact. Yes, possibly subsequent. Well, I don't remember. Who was present besides you? I told you a few names at the Chevalier party, and I have no further memory or no very different memory about this group. You think it likely the same group? Not identical, but overlapping. Can you tell us anybody who was there at Louise Branston's house who was not either a communist or a communist sympathizer? If you used the word sympathizer in a very loose sense, I can't. Have you ever described that meeting at Louise Branston's house before in any testimony or in any statement that you have made? Either my wife or I did to the FBI. When? And then, Mr. Chairman, could we have Dr. Oppenheimer's last preceding answer read and also the question? I'm trying to be sure I understood exactly what he said. Will the reporter read the question and answer, please? The question and answer were read by the reporter as herein recorded. Back to Mr. Robb. My last question was, when did you tell the FBI about the Louise Branston party? Mr. Chairman, isn't this an item not in the Commission's letter? It is in Dr. Oppenheimer's answer. I think I have a right to explore it. Did he mention Louise Branston? He mentioned two parties, and I think I have the right to find out which they were and where they were held. I'm not sure when. Conceivably, the last time was in 1942, but that is easier to check on for you than for me. Going back to the answer that Mr. Marks asked us to reread, the answer as to whether you could tell us anybody who was at Louise Branston's who was not either a communist or a communist sympathizer, I will rephrase the question as follows. Can you tell us anybody there who was not either a communist or a fellow traveler, as you define that word? I need to say that I cannot really remember who was there. I had trouble yesterday with the Chevalier meeting. I have a similar trouble here. I cannot help you out. Of those who you do remember being there, they were either communists or fellow travelers, were they not? I'm not sure of Jack Strauss. Jack who? Strauss. I'm not sure where he stood. I'm not absolutely certain whether he was at both of these meetings. He was at one of them. I think Mrs. Chevalier was not much of a communist sympathizer. She was certainly at the one at her home, possibly at the one at Louise Branston's. When you talked to the FBI agents in 1946, as you mentioned in your answer, is it your testimony that you did not recall one of these meetings had taken place at Chevalier's house? That's right. And they asked you about certain meetings, and you said that you thought they were completely irrelevant? That's my recollection. Doctor, if you didn't remember at that time where the meeting had taken place, how did you know it was completely irrelevant? It was a sudden change in questioning, which had been about Chevalier, and then there was a question as perhaps in the form, do you remember attending a meeting at East Bay at which Schneiderman talked, or something like that? And you at once said that is irrelevant. I don't recollect. You have the record. My question is, sir, how could you be sure that the meeting was irrelevant if you didn't recall where it took place? I couldn't be sure that I thought if it were relevant, it would be explained to me. Instead, the agent said that, quote, we just do this sort of thing to test your veracity, end quote. When did you recall it took place at the Chevalier's? I told my wife about this interview and she reminded me of it. When? Very shortly thereafter. A day? I don't remember. Within a day or two? Very shortly thereafter. Did you then telephone the FBI to tell them that you remembered that it took place at the Chevalier's? No, because the FBI had indicated that this was not a substantive question. Not what? Not a question of substantive interest. When you recalled it had taken place at the Chevalier's, did you then think it was relevant? Not terribly, because I defined as well as I could Chevalier's political views. Did you think it had any relevance at all after you recalled where it had taken place? I don't believe I put that question to myself. You were asked about the meeting again in 1950 by the FBI, is that correct? Right. At the time, you told them about the meeting at Chevalier's house. Right. So you thought then it was relevant. I don't remember the line of questioning. It was certainly relevant to their questioning, and they asked me about it. You next mention on page 11, Kenneth May. You knew he was an active communist, didn't you? I certainly knew it when it was public knowledge. I don't believe I knew it before that. When did that become public knowledge? That is a matter of record, but not in my mind. Didn't you know he was a Communist Party functionary at any time of your association with him? Yes. You knew that? Yes. It was public knowledge that he was a Communist Party functionary during part of my association. I see. But I don't remember the date when this occurred. In other words, while you were associating with him socially and otherwise, you knew that he was a Communist Party functionary because it was public knowledge. Socially is better than socially and otherwise. Socially? Very well. Sure. How did you come to know Dr. Weinberg? In the most normal way. I knew all of the graduate students who studied theoretical physics in the Department of Physics at Berkeley. I believe I called them all by their first name. Did you have any relationship with the Weinbergs other than that of professor and student? I think I need to say several things in answer to that. The first simple answer is no, until after the war, when he was not a student but an instructor, and when he and his wife, we saw them once or twice as was proper for dinner or tea or something. The second thing is that with most of my students, it would not be an uncommon thing for me to have dinner with them or to have lunch with them while we were working. I think my relations to Weinberg were much less close than with most of my graduate students. What was the occasion for your meeting with him and his wife after the war? He was an instructor in the physics department in Berkeley. I think we probably had dinner or tea or something with every member of the department. Did he and his wife come to your house for social occasions? Not more than once or twice. They did from time to time? No. Well, once or twice? Once or twice. I'm not certain about this. I am speculating. We did see them as we saw everybody. You mentioned yesterday recommending counsel to Dr. Weinberg at the time of his criminal trial. No, that is a misunderstanding. I beg your pardon? That is a misunderstanding. I mentioned recommending counsel to Chevalier for his passport problem. I see. It turns out that it was the same man or one of the two people who represented Weinberg in the course of his trial. I had nothing to do with his selection. Did you see Weinberg about the time of his criminal trial? No, I did not. I saw him once very briefly. I can fix the time. It was the winter of 1952 at the American Physical Society meetings. I was with another past president and the president-elect of the society, and he walked by, noticed us, shook hands, and we passed the time of day. Did you ever discuss with Weinberg the matter of his criminal trial either before or after it took place? I was represented by counsel. I know that. There were no discussions between me and Weinberg. Your counsel and Weinberg's counsel presumably did discuss it. That's right. Did you in any way help to finance Weinberg's defense in that case? I did not. When did you first hear that Weinberg had been a communist? At the time of the 1946 interview with the FBI, the agents told me. They questioned me about Weinberg, Lominitz, and so on, and I said, quote, "What is wrong with them?" He said, quote, "There is a question of their membership in the Communist Party," end quote. Were you surprised to hear that? A little bit, but not much in the case of Weinberg. You are quite sure that is the first time you ever heard or had been told he was a communist? No, I had heard an earlier rumor. When? When he came to Berkeley, that he had been a member of the YCL, the Young Communist League in Madison, but it was hearsay. Who told you that? I don't remember. Did you hear anything more about him at that time? No. Did Weinberg and Lominitz come to you to talk about Lominitz's draft deferment? No. Are you sure? Let's see. The only time this might have been would have been at the time I talked to Lominitz at the same time we talked so much yesterday in the summer of 1943. I have no recollection of Weinberg being involved in that. Do you recall an occasion in Dr. Lawrence's office when you talked to both Weinberg and Lominitz? No, I don't. In all events, Doctor, you are sure that until 1946, except for the rumor that you mentioned, you had no information to the effect that Weinberg was or had been a communist? No, I think that's right. You could not be mistaken about that? One can be mistaken about anything. This is my best recollection. You say in your answer, quote, Hiskey I did not know. No. Did you ever meet Hiskey? There is this allegation that I met him at this party. I have no recollection of it, and I don't know whether I was at the party or not. I didn't know him before the party. I didn't know him after the party. I'm not clear whether I was at the party or not. Were you ever at any party at which either Hiskey or Weinberg was present? I never had any recollection of Hiskey whatever until this story was brought up. How about Weinberg? I am sure I was at parties at which Weinberg was present. What kind of parties? Physics department, graduate school parties, I don't know what else. Left-wing parties? I would not be surprised, but I don't remember. You would expect him to be at and to find him at some such party, would you not? I would not have found it strange. When did you first meet Steve Nelson? I don't know whether it was before my marriage to my wife or not. I think it was. She thinks that it was after our marriage. When did you think you met him, and what were the circumstances under which you met him? I think it may have been in connection with a big Spanish party in the fall of 1939. Where? San Francisco. Do you recall talking to him on that occasion? No. What is there about the occasion that makes Steve Nelson stand out in your mind? He was a hero, and there was either talk of him or I saw him, I don't know. What was he a hero for? For his alleged part in the Spanish War. You knew he was a communist functionary? I knew he was a communist and an important communist. Thereafter, Steve Nelson was at your home on various occasions, was he not? That was much later. When was that? The time I remember, and I think they are the only times, were in the winter of 1941 to 42. What is the last date that you recall him being in your home? I don't recall the dates. It probably was in 1942. 1942? Yes. Summer, fall, spring, or when? I don't know. Were you at that time working on the Secret War project? I was thinking about it if it was in the winter, and I was employed on it if it was the summer. I beg your pardon? If it was in the winter, I was thinking about it and consulting about it. If it was in the summer, I was actually employed on it. In all events, whether it was in the winter or summer, at the time Steve Nelson was at your house, you had some connection with this project, did you not? Oh, yes. How many times did Steve Nelson come to your home? I would say 7, but I do not know precisely. Did you ever go to his house? I'm not clear. If so, it was only to call for him, or something like that. Call for him? Yes. Why would you have called for him? To bring him up to our house. Who else was present at your house on the occasions when Nelson was there? I have no memory of this. These were very often Sundays, and people would drop in. The occasions when he was there were not occasions when there was a large group of people. No, we would be out in the garden having a picnic or something like that. It is quite possible that my brother and sister-in-law would come, but I have no memory of this. Can you give us any idea how long these visits were with Nelson? A few hours. Each time? The ones I am thinking of, and I think they are the ones you are referring to, and the only ones that occurred, are when he and his wife and his baby would come up. What did you have in common with Steve Nelson? Nothing except an affection for my wife. Did you find his conversation interesting? The parts about Spain, yes. Was he a man of any education? No. What did you talk about? We didn't talk about much. Kitty and he reminisced. Reminisced about what? My wife's former husband, people they had known in the party. Communist Party activities. Past communist friendships. Did Nelson tell you what he was doing in California? No, I knew he was connected with the Alameda County organization. Did Nelson ever ask you what you were doing? No. Are you sure? Positive. He knew I was a scientist. He knew that? Yes. How did he know that? It was well known in the community, and we talked about it. Did you call him Steve? I think so. Did he call you Oppie? I don't remember. Probably. I don't remember. He and my wife, she will tell you about it. They had close, affectionate friend relationships, and I was a natural bystander. Doctor, you know a man named David Hawkins, did you not? Or you knew a man named David Hawkins, did you not? Here, wait, 1 second. Just going to take a sip of water. All right. Doctor, you knew a man named David Hawkins, did you not? Yes. You speak of him on page 21 of your answer. Right. How did you meet him? I know that well, I better be careful because I never am quite clear or very seldom clear how I first meet people. I believe we met him and his wife at my brother's at Stanford. I think it likely that I was at least acquainted with him on the Berkeley campus before that time, though I doubt I met his wife. Was the occasion that you think you met him at your brother's house at Stanford the occasion of some left-wing gathering? No, it was a few people on the porch or something like that. You say that you understand that Hawkins had left-wing associations. Yes. How did you understand that? I understood it in part from the conversations we had and in part from my brother. I'm not sure where I got this information. When did you have that understanding first? I don't know. Prior to 1943? Prior to his coming to Los Alamos. What were the left-wing associations that you understood that he had? Well, my brother was a good enough example. What others? He and the Morrisons were closely acquainted. Who are the Morrisons? Philip Morrison was a student of mine and was very far left. He was very far left? Yes. Was he a communist? I think it probable. Did he go to work on the project? He did. With your approval? With no relation to me. Did you ever make known to anyone that you thought that Philip Morrison was probably a communist? No. Why not? Well, let me say he was on the project in another branch quite independent of me. When he came to Los Alamos, General Groves let me understand that he knew Morrison had what he called a background, and I was satisfied that the truth was known about him. Morrison came to Los Alamos. That's right. When he came to Los Alamos, we had this discussion. He was so far left-wing that you thought that the mere fact that Hawkins was a friend of his stigmatized Hawkins too, did you not? Not stigmatized him, gave him a left-wing association. What did Morrison do at Los Alamos? I don't mean in detail, but in general. He came late and he worked in what was called the bomb physics division. He worked with the reactor we had there. Then, after the war, he built a quite ingenious new kind of reactor. Did Philip Morrison go over to Hiroshima to witness the drop? He was over there. I think he was in Japan. He certainly was not at Hiroshima. Did you designate him to go to Japan? I don't know. I don't believe so. Was your advice asked about him going there? I'm afraid to say that I don't know the answer. I don't believe I would have interposed an objection. You would not have? But I don't believe I was asked. Had you read Philip Morrison's testimony before the House Committee? I have. Was it House or Senate? Senate. Are you satisfied from that testimony that he was a communist? Yes. Were you surprised when you read that testimony? No. It accorded with what you previously knew, with what I believed. Yes. What else did you know about Hawkins' left-wing associations? I don't think I knew much more about it than I told you. Did you know anything about his wife? I think he had a brother-in-law of whom I heard it said he was a communist. Did you know a man named Parkman? Yes. Did you know that Parkman was discharged from the Air Force because of his communist leanings? No. Did you ever hear that? No. Did you know that Hawkins was a friend of Louis Branston? No. What was Hawkins' training? He was trained as a mathematician and philosopher. What was his major? I don't know. I suppose philosophy. Philosophy? I think so. Don't you know that? He was a professor of philosophy. I didn't know him as a student. He was not a physicist. No. By the way, how old was he? Do you know? No. Comparatively young, wasn't he? Yes. I think he was an instructor teaching mathematics at the time. You said, quote, I supported the suggestion of the personnel director that he, Hawkins, come to Los Alamos, end quote. Yes. How did you support that suggestion? Let me give a word of background. A committee of which Richard Tolman was a member, possibly he was chairman, had come to review the state of affairs at Los Alamos in the spring of 1943. One of their recommendations was that we get a personnel director. There were a great many that I will not here record. One of their recommendations was that we get an aide to help the personnel director and me in the relations between the military establishment and the laboratory. The personnel director was William Dennis, a professor of philosophy at Berkeley. He did not stay terribly long, but he came to help out in an emergency. What I heard indicated that Dennis proposed that Hawkins come as his aide, and I approved it. How did you approve it? I said I thought it was a good idea. However, I have relied somewhat on Hawkins' own testimony of how he got to Los Alamos because I have very little. I have almost no direct memory of it. At the time you approved that suggestion, you knew what you have told us about Hawkins' background and connections, didn't you? I did. I find in the minutes of the governing board at Los Alamos for May 3rd, 1943, this entry, quote, Dr. Oppenheimer said he was going to try to get Lieutenant Colonel Neil Asbridge added to Harmon's staff. He said Mr. Smith was leaving. He proposed to get David Hawkins from Berkeley to handle our relations with the post, end quote. Do you recall that? Obviously. So you rather heartily approved of the suggestion that Hawkins come. Oh, sure. What did Hawkins do when he got there? I don't have the records available, but his first jobs were two. One was to handle the draft deferments, which got to, and this was a job for the personnel division. He was a New Mexican. He knew the local head of the draft board. The second job was to take up the complicated negotiations between the military authority and the scientists on the acceptance of a building, the installation of equipment, the completion of housing. That was the way it started out. I also asked him to serve, along with Manley and Kennedy, on the Laboratory Security Committee, which had largely to do with physical security. I asked him, after discussing the thing with General Groves, to write the technical history of the laboratory. That was much later. By that time I knew him quite well and had come to have a sense of confidence in him, of great confidence. Hawkins wrote the manual of security for Los Alamos. I don't remember that, but it would have been likely. I discussed security with him many times. His views and mine were in agreement. Hawkins became more or less your administrative assistant, didn't he? For a while. The only person who had that title was David Dow. Wasn't Hawkins, in fact, whether he had the title of it or not, pretty much your administrative assistant? On the matters I have discussed, yes. Did Hawkins have access to all the secret information on the project at Los Alamos? Most of it, I should think, yes. When he wrote the history, he had access to all of it, didn't he? Most of it. I still think that some things, like production rates and so on, would not have come his way. Did his wife come to Los Alamos with him? Yes. You knew she was extremely left-wing, if not a communist, didn't you? I didn't have that impression, but I may be wrong. You knew that her brother was, anyway. Yes, I heard that. Did you ever make known to any security officer what you knew about Hawkins and his wife? What I knew was not very substantial. When the question of the report came up, I asked General Groves whether he regarded Hawkins' background as a reason for not doing this. I also discussed it at one other time in connection with a protest Groves made about one of his actions. You asked General Groves? Right. Did you tell him what you knew? I knew nothing beyond what was obvious, that he had a left-wing background. Did you tell him what you knew? I don't remember. You say you don't remember. No. I imagine I didn't in the light of the record in the other cases, but I don't remember. I know we talked about it. What was there in Hawkins' background which led you to believe that he was qualified by training or experience to be an administrative assistant to you at Los Alamos? For the jobs that I had in mind, he had impressed me as a reasonable, tactful, intelligent person, interested in science, familiar with it. As far as I know, he was in fact very good. He was teaching philosophy, wasn't he? No, he was teaching mathematics at the time. He knew a great deal about science. His philosophical interests were in science. I may add that he was certainly not the only person in the country for this job. Doctor, we spoke yesterday of your interview with Colonel Lansdale. I want to read you some extracts from the transcript of that interview, sir. Colonel Lansdale said to you, according to this transcript, may we have the date? September 12, 1943. This is the interview that took place at the Pentagon. Colonel Lansdale said to you, quote, we know, for instance, that it is the policy of the Communist Party at this time that when a man goes into the army, his official connections with the party are thereupon ipso facto severed. End quote. You answered, quote, well, I was told by a man who came from a very prominent man who was a member of the Communist Party in the Middle West, that it was the policy of the party there that when a man entered confidential war work, he was not supposed to remain a member of the party. End quote. Who told you that? I have no recollection at all. I will think, if you wish. I wish you would, sir. From the Middle West. Read that again. Quote, I was told by a man who came from a very prominent man who was a member of the Communist Party in the Middle West, that it was the policy of the party there that when a man entered confidential war work, he was not supposed to remain a member of the party. Who was that man? I recollect nothing about it. I will be glad to think about it. Do you want to think now? I would prefer not to. If I can think about it and tell you tomorrow, it simply rings no bell. You don't recall anybody ever told you that? No, I said yesterday I didn't recollect. I know you did. Does this serve to refresh your recollection in any way? Quite to the contrary. From the Middle West? You then spoke about your brother. May I inquire, Mr. Chairman, if these transcripts are taken from recordings, just so we can understand what is being read? Yes, I have every reason to believe it is accurate. I didn't question that. I just wondered what the origin was. I don't think that is necessarily a question counsel should have to answer. I asked the chairman, sir. My answer is I don't know. If you wish to discuss it further, I would be glad to. I thought it was a matter that could be answered simply. You spoke of your brother and said, quote, it is not only that he is not a member, I think he has no contact, end quote. Do you recall that? No, I don't recall it, but that I can imagine saying. Lansdale said, quote, do you know about his wife, Jackie? End quote. You answered, quote, I know I overwhelmingly urged about 18 months ago when we started that she should drop social ones which I regarded as dangerous. Whether they have in fact done that, I don't know. End quote. Lansdale said, quote, well, I am quite confident that your brother Frank has no connection with the communists. I am not so sure about his wife, end quote. You answered, quote, I am not sure either, but I think it likely some of its importance has left here. Also, I believe it to be true that they do not have any. I don't know this for a fact, but if they had, I didn't know it, any well-established contacts in Berkeley. You see, they came from Palo Alto, and they had such contacts there. Then my brother was unemployed for 3 very salutary months, which changed his ideas quite a lot. And when they started in Berkeley, it was for this war job. I do not know much. I do not know, but I think it quite probable that his wife Jackie had never had a unit or group to which she was attached in any way. The thing that worried me was that their friends were very left wing, and I think it is not always necessary to call a unit meeting for it to be a pretty good contact. End quote. Doctor, who were the friends and social contacts that you might have had in mind when making that statement? My sister-in-law in Berkeley and your brother. I'm not sure who I did have in mind. My sister-in-law had a very old friend called Winona Nettlesky. Who was she? She was the wife of a physicist who left here, quite Russian, who had once been my student. She was a good friend of Jackie's. She earned her living in some federal housing agency or social security agency. Was she a communist? I believe so. Was she a friend of your sister-in-law in 1943? I would think so. She was a friend. I don't know how much they saw each other. But in all events, you thought it cause for worry. I would not have thought that a special cause for worry. I'm having trouble in remembering what I could have had in mind and what I did have in mind. Can you think of anyone else that you might have had in mind as dangerous social contacts of your sister-in-law and your brother? I don't know much about the life in Berkeley. I'm afraid I can't. Lansdale said again, quote, to refer again to this business concerning the party, to make it clear the fact a person says they have severed connections with the party, the fact that they have at present no apparent interest or contact in it does not show where they have unquestionably formerly been members that they are dangerous to us, end quote. You said, quote, I agree with that, end quote. You still agree with that, do you? Yes. Mr. Chairman, I repeat the same request I made with respect to the previous transcript, that we would like to see a copy of the full transcript. May I say with respect to that Dr. Oppenheimer will be given an opportunity to see documents reflecting conversations. They cannot be taken from the building. We appreciate that. When may we have that opportunity? When the board and council have finished with the questioning. You mean this afternoon? Whenever this is concluded. Lansdale said to you, according to this transcript, speaking of your reluctance to disclose the name of Professor X, quote, I don't see how you can have any hesitancy of disclosing the name of the man who has actually been engaged in an attempt of espionage in time of war. I mean, my mind does not run along these channels, end quote. You said, quote, I know it is a tough problem, and I am worried about it a lot, end quote. That was a correct statement of your attitude, wasn't it? I would assume so. Lansdale, referring again to your reluctance to disclose the name, says, quote, well, if you won't do it, you won't do it. But I don't think I won't ask you again. Now, I want to ask you this, and again, for the same reason, which implies you're here, you may not answer. Who do you know on the project in Berkeley who are now, that's probably a hypothetical question, or have been members of the Communist Party, end quote. You answered, quote, I will try to answer that question. The answer will, however, be incomplete. I know for a fact, I learned on my last visit to Berkeley that both Lominitz and Weinberg were members. I suspected that before, but was not sure. I never had any way of knowing. I will think a minute, but there were other people. There was I don't know whether she is still employed or was at one time a secretary who was a member, end quote. Quote, Lansdale, do you recall her name? Oppenheimer, yes, her name was Jane Muir. I am, of course, not sure she was a member, but I think she was. In the case of my brother, it is obvious that I know. In the cases of the others, it's just things that pile up, that I look at that way. I'm not saying that I couldn't think of other people. It's a hell of a big project. You can raise some names." End quote. Doctor, having heard me read those lines, will you now concede that you knew at that time that both Lominitz and Weinberg had been members of the Communist Party? Evidently. Was I told by the security officers? I don't know. I have just read what you said. So when you wrote that letter of October 19, 1943, forwarding Lomnitz's request to be transferred back to the project for military services, you knew that he had been a member of the Communist Party, didn't you? So it appears. And you knew as early as 1943 that Weinberg had been too. So it appears. Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, what troubles me about this whole method of examination is that counsel is reading from a transcript bits and parts without the full course of the conversation which took place to a witness whose memory, at best as any one of ours would be, is very, very hazy upon all these things. And picking here a sentence and there a sentence out of context and then holding him to the answer. I do think that this is a method of questioning that seems to me to be very unfair. Oh, that was all Mr. Garrison. Whoops. Yeah, Mr. Robb does not think it's unfair. So I could read that again, but yeah, Mr. Garrison is protesting that it's not fair. Sorry, mixed that up there. So Garrison here is pointing out just the very obvious fact that Oppenheimer doesn't remember everything. None of us would remember all this stuff from 10 years ago, and he's trying his best. And so cherry picking these answers, these transcripts, is just kind of a bad and unfair way of going about this. So could we do something else, I guess? Anyway, sorry about that mix-up there. Back to Robb. Mr. Chairman, I don't mean to make any argument about the matter, but I assume that this board is following this transcript. If the board feels I am being unfair at any point, I suppose the board will interpose. Why shouldn't counsel be allowed to follow as any court of law? And this is not even a trial. As you no doubt know, I have tried a good many cases, and I don't think it would be in the ordinary course of trial. I disagree with you. I resent counsel's statement that I am trying to be unfair with this witness, because I assure you that I have made every attempt to be fair with him. In fact, were I trying to be unfair, I would not ask this witness any of these questions, but would leave it in the file for the board to read. I'm giving this witness a chance to make whatever explanation he wishes to make. I still think that the fair thing would be to read the whole conversation and ask him what parts you want, instead of to pick isolated questions. On the point of picking isolated questions without trying to look at this whole question at this moment, I think it is clear that this interview concerned itself with matters which are involved in the questions Mr. Robb has been putting to the witness, and which are generally, I think, not new material. General Nichols' letter of December 23 and Dr. Oppenheimer's reply of March 4, I think both address themselves in one way or another to these individuals, Lominitz, Weinberg, Bohm, which have been the subject of these questions. I would say, Mr. Garrison, that I don't think it would be helpful to you at this point to have the transcript. I have said, however, that Dr. Oppenheimer and his counsel will be entitled to examine it, and certainly after examination, if you wish to reopen any of this testimony, you will be given every opportunity to do so. I think it is the feeling of the chairman of the board that things are not taken here out of context in a way which is prejudicial. I think also that the board has heard Dr. Oppenheimer say that with respect to some of these matters he has no recollection, which at least to me is perfectly understandable. Many of these things have taken place many years ago. I do not think that it is the purpose of counsel to develop anything beyond what the facts are in this case. At least that is my interpretation. That is my endeavor, Mr. Chairman. May I ask you whether or not you recall this Jane Muir? I remember her not well. How did you happen to know her? I met her and her husband through the Chevaliers sometime before the war. Mr. Chairman, I don't want to be captious or legalistic, But this is the example of the kind of problem. Jane Muir is not mentioned in the Commission's letter. Are we to be given a chance to remember all there is to remember about particular individuals? Now Dr. Oppenheimer is being read aloud out of things that it is said he said a great many years ago, and new names come out which are not in the letter and which we have never heard, and now he is asked all about them. That seems to me, I submit, not in keeping with the spirit of the letter. If he had volunteered the name of Jane Muir in testimony, that would be another matter, but this is something that is a complete surprise. Mr. Chairman, is it Mr. Garrison's position that he wishes time to consult with his client about the Jane Muir matter before we go into it? With respect to any new name that is brought into this without any warning at all, we should be given a chance to have Dr. Oppenheimer reflect on what he remembers about it, and for us to have a chance to talk about it. We will let the Jane Muir go, and come back to it at some future date if counsel feels that would be fair. I think that would be fair with respect to every new name. We will go on to something else then. Then you were asked by Colonel Lansdale, quote, "Can you tell me the names of anyone at Los Alamos that have been or are now party members?" End quote. You answered, quote, "I can't tell you the numbers of any who are now, I can't tell you the numbers of any who now are. I assume that means names. But I know that at least Mrs. Serber was a member. She comes from the Leoff family in Philadelphia." End quote. To the best of my knowledge, this is not true. That is the same question. I think not, Mr. Chairman. I think this is certainly in the scope of the letter of notification which Dr. Oppenheimer has challenged. Dr. Oppenheimer has said in his answer that he knew of no former member of the party at Los Alamos except his wife. He said that with some emphasis and repeated it here. I think I have the right to ask him whether he did know that Mrs. Serber was a member. I asked about Mrs. Serber yesterday. Mrs. Serber's name has appeared in this proceeding. Don't you know that you did know in 1943 that Mrs. Serber had been a member of the party? I don't know that she was a member of the party. I don't think she was a member of the party. You testified yesterday you would be very much surprised to find if she ever had been. That is right, I would still be today. Have you any idea how this statement got in this transcript? No. Do you know that Mrs. Serber came from the Leoff family in Philadelphia? That I know. When did you know that? Long ago, 15 years ago. Beg pardon? 15 years ago. How did you find that out? She told me. My wife also knew her. Are you at a breaking point? Yes, sir. Let us take a recess. Brief recess. Okay. So, getting very spicy there. Garrison is not happy, and so he is really just starting to question the whole methodology of this proceeding, which has largely just become a series of Robb pulling up clandestinely recorded conversations and taking transcripts of them and then reading them out and asking Oppenheimer if he remembers them, and then Oppenheimer saying, I don't remember, to like 90% of the stuff, and then Robb continuing, and Garrison is like, this is unfair and kind of pointless because we have no time to review, and so our client just doesn't remember these things. And the board, the chairman of the board at least, Gordon Gray, is being pretty lax, I think, to Robb. He's saying like, well, the name appeared before, so why not? He's not really like responding well to Garrison's complaints. But yeah, because one of the things that they said is that if new names or new events, new accusations are brought up, that counsel will have time to review them and the original letter will be amended. That's what they said on day one. And so I think Garrison's appealing back to that statement to say, you should be doing that because you're, talking about a lot of new stuff right now, and I don't think it's fair to do that. So, yeah, I'll take a brief drink of water and then get back to this case. All right. So, after the recess, Garrison has more to say. Okay. Mr. Chairman, forgive me for coming back to the same point, but during the recess, I discussed this problem with my partner, Mr. Silverman, who has spent his life trying cases in the state of New York. I'm not a trial lawyer, sir. Our practice, I am informed up there, universally, is that when counsel is cross-examining a witness on a transcript he has never seen, counsel for the other side, if he asks the court for a copy so he may read along with it, that request is granted. So, if nothing else, I would not think of impugning this to Mr. Robb, and I hope he won't misunderstand me. I think it is the basis of the rule. That is the only reason I mention it. In other words, to make sure that the questions are in fact being read accurately from the transcript, and there are no interlineations or marks or matters of that sort that might perhaps raise a question as to the accuracy of what is there quite apart from the method by which the transcript was arrived at, and also to understand what the thread and continuity of the matter is. I merely report that to the chairman. I don't want to put this on the basis of rules of law because, God no, it is the rule here that this is not a trial but an inquiry, and I should suppose that a fortiori what is proper in court of law would be accorded to us here in an inquiry. I do not labor the point. I present it to you, and I will rest upon it. May I make a comment? Surely. This last quotation about Mrs. Serber strikes me as so bizarre that I am troubled about the accuracy of the document. I'm not certain. Do you know, Mr. Robb, whether this was taken down by a stenographer or was it from a tape? Colonel Lansdale will be here. I might ask him. He is the one who conducted the interview. I would like to be excused with counsel for the board for a moment, if you please. Mr. Chairman, I don't agree at all with the statement of law which has been made by Mr. Garrison, although I confess I am not a New York trial lawyer. It has always been my understanding that when a witness is questioned about inconsistent statements, he is read the statements and he is asked if he made them. However, it is entirely immaterial to me whether counsel follows this statement or not. If the chairman wants to have counsel have a copy of it, it is all right with me. We would appreciate that. Very well. I'm about to make the ruling that Mr. Robb follow reading this transcript as Mr. Robb reads it. Have you got a copy of it, Mr. Rolander? I just went out and asked the secretary to try to locate a copy from the original files. I thought that might be most helpful. May the record now show, Mr. Chairman, that we are handing to Mr. Garrison the photostat copy of the interview with Dr. Oppenheimer by Lieutenant Colonel Lansdale, September 12, 1943, consisting of 26 pages. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am reading from page 10. The transcript shows, Doctor, that you were asked this question by Colonel Lansdale. Quote, now do you know, was Mr. Serber a member of the party? End quote. You answered, quote, I think it is possible, but I don't know. End quote. Do you recall that question or answer? No. Do you think at that time think it possible that Mr. Serber was a member of the party? That he was then a member of the party? Yes. No. Did you think it possible that he had been? Possible but unlikely. Were both Mr. and Mrs. Serber then at Los Alamos? Right. What did you know about their background? I knew them quite well. Did you know that they were leftists? Yes. Did you know that they were at least fellow travelers? I would say at most fellow travelers. At most fellow travelers. Yes. How did you acquire that information? They were good friends of mine. From things they said to you and from activities you observed? That's right. What activities? Mrs. Serber was extremely active in Spanish relief at the time they were in Berkeley. What else? Talk. What talk? Just talk about affairs and politics. Communism? Not as such. Had you seen the Serbers at these left-wing gatherings that you mentioned? Oh, yes. Frequently? At the Spanish things, very frequently. Along with other people that you mentioned. Right. What was Serber doing at Los Alamos? He was a very prominent and constructive member of the Theoretical Physics Division. Did he have access to classified information? Indeed he did. He created it. Now, skipping down, you were asked, quote, how about Dave Hawkins? End quote. And you said, quote, I don't think he was, I would not say so. Meaning, I don't think he was a member of the Communist Party. Do you recall that? No, I clearly am not recalling this conversation at all. Was that your view in 1943 that you didn't think he was a member or had been? I wish I knew what my view on these things was. Mr. Chairman, I think we ought to give the witness the question and the answer as it appears here. It reads, quote, I don't think he was, I would not say so. That is what I read. You interpreted it. Very well. If you don't want me to give the witness the benefit of an interpretation, I won't do it. The next question and answer. Quote, now, have you yourself ever been a member of the Communist Party? End quote. You answered, no. Quote, Lansdale, you've probably belonged to every front organization on the coast. Oppenheimer, just about. Doctor, do you recall that question and answer? No, I don't. I don't recall this interview. If you said that to Colonel Lansdale, were you jocular? I don't think I could have been jocular during this interview. Quote, Lansdale, would you in fact have considered yourself at one time a fellow traveler? Oppenheimer, I think so. My association with these things was very brief and very intense. End quote. Do you recall that at all? I'm not recollecting anything. You may find a phrase that I do recollect. In all events, Doctor, your answer, quote, I think so, my association with these things was very brief and very intense. It is, end quote, it is now your testimony that was a correct statement of fact. It was very intense. Brief is a relative word. Colonel Lansdale said, quote, I should imagine the latter anyway, end quote. Now, on page 11, you said, quote, it was historically quite brief and quite intense, and I should say I was Lansdale. Now I have reason to believe that you yourself were felt out. I don't say asked, but felt out to ascertain how you felt about it, passing a little information to the party. Oppenheimer, you have reason? Lansdale, I say I have reason to believe that's as near as I can come to stating it. Am I right or wrong? Oppenheimer, if it was so gentle I did not know it. Lansdale, you don't know. Do you have anyone who is close to you? No, that's the wrong word. Who is an acquaintance of yours, who may have perhaps been a guest in your house, whom you perhaps knew through friends or relatives, who is a member of the Communist Party? By that I mean Oppenheimer. My brother, obviously. Lansdale. Well, no, I don't mean him. Oppenheimer. I think probably you mean someone who just visited for a few hours. Lansdale. Yes. Oppenheimer. Yes, certainly. The answer to that is certainly yes. Lansdale. Would you care to give me any of their names? Oppenheimer. There is a girl called Eldred Nelson. End quote. Do you know a girl called Eldred Nelson? No, I know a man by that name. Who was he? He was a student of mine. At the risk of finding I said something else 10 years ago, I would say he was not a communist. Having heard Colonel Lansdale's question about whether you had any acquaintance of yours who might have been a guest in your house, whom you knew perhaps through friends and relatives, is it now clear to you who Colonel Lansdale was talking about? I don't know. It might well be Steve Nelson. Isn't that pretty plain? Yes. Why didn't you mention Steve Nelson? I seem to have mentioned a Nelson. Eldred. Eldred Nelson is not a girl. He is not a communist. I think this only adds to my confusion about it. Very well. I will continue. Quote, Lansdale, suppose I've got a bunch of names here. Some of them are right and some of them are wrong. You don't mind treating it that way, do you? Oppenheimer, no. Lansdale, did you know William Schneiderman? Oppenheimer, I know who he is. He is the secretary of the Communist Party. I've met him at cocktail parties. Lansdale, you have no real personal acquaintance with him. Oppenheimer, no. End quote. Now, you had met Schneiderman at these meetings where he lectured, had you not? Yes. Were those cocktail parties? Drinks were served. Were they cocktail parties? No, I think they were evening parties. Did you tell Lansdale about that? I don't know what I told him. If I tell you that the transcript shows you didn't, would you accept that? Quote, Lansdale, do you know a fellow named Rudy Lambert? Oppenheimer, I'm not sure. Do you know what he looks like? Lansdale, no, I've never seen him. He's a member of the party. Do you know a Dr. Hannah L. Peters? End quote. You knew what Rudy Lambert looked like, didn't you? Sure. Why did you ask Lansdale what he looked like? I don't know that I did. If you did, Doctor, would it mean that you were ducking the question? I would think so. The end of the question by Lansdale. Quote, do you know a Dr. Hannah L. Peters? Oppenheimer. Yes, I know her quite well. Lansdale. Do you know that she's a communist? Oppenheimer. I certainly knew that she was very close. I did not know she was a member. Lansdale. You don't know what her position in the party is? Oppenheimer. No. I didn't even know she was a member. Lansdale. Do you have any more than just an acquaintance with her? Oppenheimer. Yes, I know her quite well. Her husband is on the project. End quote. That was true, wasn't it? Yes. Quote, Lansdale, how about a fellow by the name of Isaac Folkoff? Oppenheimer, I don't know. I knew a Richard Folkoff who was a member of considerable importance. End quote. Of what? I'm reading you what the transcript shows. A member of considerable importance. You knew that Isaac Folkoff was a member of considerable importance, didn't you? Yes. I think that is a garble in the transcript again. Richard Folkoff was a member of Consumers Union, as I told you yesterday. Quote, Lansdale, how about a man by the name of Steve Nelson? Oppenheimer, he was a professional party member. He's an organizer. Lansdale, did you know him very well at all? Did you know him well at all? Under what circumstances did you know him? Oppenheimer, he was a friend of my wife's former husband who was killed in Spain. I have a thoroughly unprofessional acquaintance with him. End quote. Do you recall saying anything like that? I recall telling Lansdale about my wife and Nelson. Quote, Lansdale, how about Hakon Chevalier? Oppenheimer, is he a member of the party? Lansdale, I don't know. Oppenheimer, he is a member of the faculty and I know him well. I wouldn't be surprised if he were a member. He is quite a Red. End quote. That is true. He was quite a Red. You would not have been surprised to find he was a member of the party, would you? I think I would during the period I knew him. Now I will skip over to page 14. Is there anything else in connection with those particular questions that you would like to have me read, Mr. Garrison? I have not read all in between. I did not leave out anything for a couple of pages. At the top of page 14, quote, Lansdale. Now, I want to ask you to go back to Lomnitz. You told me when I was down there that when you broke the subject to, what do you call him? Rossi? Oppenheimer. Rossi. End quote. What do you mean by down there? Lomnitz was never at Los Alamos. No, quote, you told me when I was down there. I guess he means Los Alamos. I don't know. Quote, when you first broke the subject to him about going on the place, you stated that he was uncertain. He came up to your house and did what you characterized as a good deal of soul searching. I would like to know whether that soul searching or discussion of his own feelings had any relation to his work in the party. Oppenheimer. None whatever. I did not know he was a member of the party. Lansdale. Until just recently. Oppenheimer. Yes, I knew he was extremely red, but frankly I thought he was a member of the Trotskyite faction. Lansdale. Which would ipso facto prevent him from, Oppenheimer, being a member of the party. That's what I thought at the time. What he said he wanted at the time was to be a soldier and be one of the American people in that way and help mold their feelings by being a soldier. And wasn't that more worthwhile than working in this project? I told him he obviously had a lot of talent. He had training that he was throwing right away, and that if he could make up his mind, and it was a clear-cut decision to use himself as a scientist and nothing else, that then that was the right thing to do. Lansdale. What led you to exact from him a promise or to make the condition of giving up political activities? Oppenheimer. Because he had distributed leaflets and because it was just generally obvious that he was a member of the Union and radical societies. End quote. Does that refresh your recollection as to what you knew about Lomnitz's background and what you said to him before he went on the project? So that's kind of interesting. He brings up that uh, Lomnitz was a Trotskyite communist. Of course, Trotsky was basically the rival of Stalin in the early days after the Soviet Union, and Trotsky ended up losing out to Stalin, and he got exiled to Mexico, where he would later be assassinated. And that's just kind of fascinating. So Trotsky was Trotsky and his allies, obviously, were not like in vogue in the Soviet Union, right? So they were pretty much banned. So Trotsky was exiled, and then all of his allies were, banned, sent to gulags, things like that, like various typical Soviet Union things. But then in America, it sounds like the Communist Party of America had a policy that if you were a Trotskyite, you wouldn't be a member of the party, just based on what I'm reading here, which is interesting because that goes to show how Oppenheimer was saying, oh, when I first got into politics, I didn't realize how strong an influence the Soviet Union had on the American Communist Party, which is interesting because, theoretically they could be independent, right? One could have different policies than the other, but it seems that one was heavily influenced by the other, which would also make sense. So, yeah. Anyway, continuing. The union, I guess, is the FAECT. The leaflets, I don't remember. Do you recall having any such conversations with Lansdale? I didn't remember our discussing Lomnitz. Do you recall that you did have a discussion with Lomnitz about his activities before he went on the project? I think the substance of the conversation is that if he could be a scientist, he should, and he should do just that. Do you now recall laying down the conditions to him about giving up his previous political activities? I don't recall it. We discussed it yesterday. I am not likely to recall that matter today. I don't mean to deny it, sir. Quote, Lansdale. Now, you have stated to me, and also I think to General Groves, that in your opinion, membership in the party was incompatible with work on the project from a loyalty standpoint. Oppenheimer, yes. Quote, end quote. That was your viewpoint, wasn't it? Yes. Quote, Lansdale. Now, do you also go so far as to believe that persons who are not actually members but still retain their loyalty to the party or their adherence to the party line are in the same category? Oppenheimer. Let me put it this way. Loyalty to the party, yes. Adherence to the party line, maybe no. In that it need not necessarily, although it often is, be the sign of subservience. At the present time, I don't know what the party line is in too much detail, but I've heard from Mrs. Tolman, Tolman's wife, that the party line at present is not to discuss post-war affairs. I would be willing to say that anyone who, well, let me put it this way, whose loyalty is above all else to the party or to Russia obviously is incompatible with loyalty to the US. This is, I think, the heart of it. The party has its own discipline, end quote. Do you recall saying that? No, I don't recollect much about this. This, however, sounds like what I thought. You have no doubt that was your view at the time. Substantially, that was my view. Is there any difference between what I have read and what your view was at that time? I don't know. It is a long couple of paragraphs. It is a long time ago. I think it is substantially what I then thought. Lansdale then continued, quote, Now, I was coming to that. I would like to hear from you your reasons as to why you believe, let's stick to membership in the party, is incompatible to complete loyalty to the project, when, to state something a little bit foolishly, membership in the Democratic Party certainly wouldn't be. Oppenheimer. Oh, wait, sorry. Still quoting. Oppenheimer. It's an entirely different party. For one thing, I think I'd put it this way. The Democratic Party is the framework of the social customs of this country, and I do not think that is true of the Communist Party. At least I think that there are certainly many communists who are above all decent guys, but there are also some that are above all communists. It's primarily that question of personal honor that I think is involved. I don't know whether that answers the question, but my idea is that being a Democrat doesn't guarantee that you're not a floor flusher, and also it has no suggestion just by virtue of your being a Democrat that you would think it would be all right to cheat other people for a purpose, and I'm not too sure about this with respect to the Communist Party, end quote. Do you recall saying that? Saying anything like that? I don't. Would you say that did represent your views at that time? I find nothing incompatible between it and what I remember. This is for me not a very easy line of questioning, because I don't recollect what I said and I remember what I thought only in general terms. Before you turn the page, I think that as a matter of record, at the end of the fourth line, the party, as you read it, I think, quote, the party has its own discipline, end quote. At least this copy seems to say, quote, the party has its own disciples. End quote. Disciples, that is right. I don't think it is material. I think this indicates the problems of accuracy because it would probably make more sense as Mr. Robb read it. There seems to be a pen and ink interlineation. The word floor flusher is not quite correct. Now I will turn to page 17. Mr. Garrison, is there something you want to read? Afterward, after I read it over. Lansdale starts on page 16 and makes quite a little talk, which I won't read because it is not essential to the context. At the top of page 17, he says, quote, Here we are. Here we know that information is streaming out from this place every day. We know about some of it. How much of it is there that we don't know about? Oppenheimer. Places other than the West Coast? Lansdale. Sure. We know that definite efforts are being made to find out. They wouldn't be going to these efforts unless they really wanted it. Now, what shall we do? Shall we sit back and say, well, my God, maybe the guy recanted. Maybe he isn't at all. Oppenheimer. Hard for me to say because of my own personal trends. And as I say, I know that the Cerbers afford a good illustration of this. I would hesitate to say to a stranger about another close-up person whose history was the same as that of Mrs. Cerbers. Sure, she's all right, but I know the servers and I am confident of them. Now, I have worked on rather a personal basis. I don't know the Woodwards are members. I did not know that until General Groves mentioned it the other day, that there was some question of it. I feel that in the case of the Cerbers, I could understand that very well. But I just don't know in a general case. It's impossible to say. I don't know any of these people in Berkeley. I don't know Weinberg and Lominitz well enough to swear. Lansdale. Why is he moving heaven and earth to keep out of the army? Oppenheimer. He told me he thought he was being framed, and I said, I think that's nonsense. Why would you be framed? And he said, well, part of the general scheme, maybe they're after bigger game than the party. Lansdale. Did you ask him what the bigger game was? Oppenheimer. He said he thought you were after the Union. Lansdale. We're not. Oppenheimer. Well, I suggest you keep your eyes open. I persuaded him, I think, that he should not try to stay on the project there. End quote. Do you recall that portion of your conversation with Lansdale? No. Would you deny that it took place? No. Your answer is no? No. Do you know whether these dots represent words that the stenographer didn't catch? I don't. Now we go to page 22. Lansdale said, quote, can you tell me any more? Did Weinberg, it was Weinberg and Bohm who came to you, wasn't it? Oppenheimer, yes, they came to me in Lawrence's office. Lansdale, yes. Did Weinberg and Bohm say anything? What did they say about the party? Oppenheimer, they didn't say anything about the party. Lansdale, they didn't? Did they talk about the Union? Oppenheimer, they talked, well, they didn't even talk about the Union. They talked about, I think I've given you a fairly good, I don't know what they might have said if we had met in the woods someplace, but we met after all where there were two secretaries in the room. Lansdale, oh, they were there? Oppenheimer, I don't know whether the door was closed or not, but it was extremely open. It was an extremely open interview. I saw Lominitz more or less. Well, I saw him first at once at one of the offices of a man, and we walked out to telegraph, but his discussion was a little bit more uninhibited than the others. These two fellows were concerned with only one thing. They said they had worked closely with Rossi. They thought he was a good guy, and that they thought he was being framed for his activities in the Union and his political sympathies. And they thought that because of this, they were also in danger, of such a nature that they should get out of the project into some other useful work, or were they likely to be treated in the same way? Lansdale. Now let me ask you this. From what you stated to them, if they were in fact not fulfilling the conditions which you mentioned to them, which you said to them would have been tantamount to telling, then if you are doing that, you'd better get out. Oppenheimer. Yes. Lansdale. That is correct, isn't it? Oppenheimer. Yes, that is, if they were violating any of the three rules, which meant active in union, maintaining any contacts with Reds, not maintaining discretion, they were useless to the project. End quote. Doctor, does that refresh your recollection about laying down some rules for Lominitz, Bohm, and Weinberg? It refreshes to the extent that these three things said to them in the summer of 1943 would have been natural for me to say. I don't believe these were rules established by me long in advance. I think this refers to this conversation. Don't you recall now that you had a conversation with at least Lominitz in which you had told him prior to his coming on the project that he would have to abide by these rules? I don't remember those three rules at all. I think it natural that I talk to them at this time in those terms. I see. Your mind is a blank of any talk you might have had with Lominitz prior to his going on the project? No, it is not a blank. I have told you a little about it here, and I testified to the extent I can recall it. Aside from that, you could not recall anything? Right. And your memory is not refreshed by what I read you? No, on the whole, it is confused by it. Very well, doctor. Did Hakon Chevalier tell you he had been interviewed by the FBI about the Elton Chevalier incident? He did. When did he tell you that? June or July of 1946. Shortly after he was interviewed. Fairly shortly after. Did he tell you how long before that he had been interviewed? I don't remember. Did you get the impression that it had been very recent? I don't recollect the time interval. It was not a year or a month or anything or a half year. What did he tell you about the interview? He told me that he and Elton had been interviewed simultaneously, that they had questioned him about his approach to me. What else? That they had asked him if he had approached anyone else, and I think, well, that they picked him up at Stinson Beach and had taken him into headquarters. Anything else? That they pressed him about whether he talked to anyone else. Did he tell you what he said? Not in any detail. How did he give you that information? In person or by telephone or by letter or what? What I recollect is that he came to our home. In Berkeley? Yes. Was that before or after you were interviewed by the FBI? It was quite a while before. So when you were interviewed by the FBI, you knew substantially what Chevalier had told them. Not in great detail. I said substantially. Yes, I think so. Did you also learn what Elton had said? No. Did you attempt to find out? No. Now, you recall that you were interviewed by the FBI again in May 1950? Yes. That was at Princeton, wasn't it? Yes. Did you tell the agents on that occasion that you didn't know Weinberg was a communist until it became a matter of public knowledge? I may have said I was not certain. My own recollection of it is contrary to this interview with Lansdale, which is that the first time I was alerted to it was by the FBI in 1946, but it is clear that I learned something about it, or it may be clear that I learned something about it during the war. Didn't you tell the FBI agent on that occasion that you did not know that Weinberg was a communist until it became a matter of public knowledge? I don't remember. You don't remember whether you told them that or not? No. When did it become a matter of public knowledge? It is still not. Long after 1943, wasn't it? He still denied it, and I don't quite know what this refers to. Doctor, did you know prior to the time I began to read them to you that there existed transcripts of your interviews with Colonel Pash and Colonel Lansdale? I imagined that. You think so? Yes. How do you think you found that out? I didn't know it. I said I imagined it. You imagined it. I thought almost certain that there would be a transcript of security talks. Had you asked anybody about it? I don't think so. Were you interested? I should have been. I don't think I was. In that same interview with the FBI in May 1950, did you tell the agent that you had made a big mistake in not dropping your Communist Party friend long before you did? I certainly don't recognize that. Would you say you didn't tell them that? I need to know more of the context and when this was and what it was about. It was May. I don't mean the date of the interview, but the context of the interview and what time we were referring to. Taken in this bald form, did you say anything to that effect? I don't know. Doctor, there came a time in 1949 when you testified before the House Committee on Un-American Activities concerning Dr. Peters, didn't you? Right. Do you recall what paper it was that it came out in? Oh, wait, sorry. Your testimony was thereafter reported in the public press, wasn't it? Yes. Do you recall what paper it was that it came out in? It was the Rochester paper. Did you see that item in the Rochester paper? It was sent to me. Who sent it to you? Oh, many people. Peters, probably Condon, several other people. Was your testimony accurately reported in the press? As As I remember, it was fairly accurately reported in the press. It was supposed to be secret testimony. I have before me a photostat. I'm sorry I have not a copy, Mr. Garrison, but I will read most of it. A story of the Rochester Times-Union, Rochester, New York, June 15, 1949. The headline was, quote, Dr. Oppenheimer once termed Peters quite red. The lead-off paragraph is, quote, Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, wartime director of the atom bomb laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, recently testified that he once termed Dr. Bernard Peters of the University of Rochester a dangerous man and quite a red, end quote. The Times-Union Washington Bureau reported today. The story then continues after some explanatory paragraphs. Let me interrupt to say, have you another photostat of this news story? I would like to see it if we could. Surely. Is this question to be about Bernard Peters or Hannah Peters? Bernard. The letter mentions Hannah Peters and not Bernard. The letter mentions Hannah Peters and... Oh, wait, sorry. Are you sticking to that technicality, Mr. Garrison? I was asking you if this was an inquiry into Bernard Peters' background. In Dr. Oppenheimer's testimony, we have been talking about Bernard Peters for a couple of days. The newspaper story continues after some explanatory paragraphs. Quote, in his testimony, Dr. Oppenheimer said he became acquainted with the existence of a communist cell at Berkeley by disclosure of the intelligence agencies of the government. The quotes are not closed, but I assume they should be there. Concerning Dr. Peters, Dr. Oppenheimer said he had known the scientist as a graduate student in the physics department in the late 1930s. Said Dr. Oppenheimer, Dr. Peters was, I think, a German national. He was a member of the German National Communist Party. He was imprisoned by the Nazis and escaped by a miracle. He came to this country. I know nothing of his early period in this country. He arrived in California and violently denounced the Communist Party as being a do-nothing party. Dr. Oppenheimer said he told Major De Silva he believed Dr. Peters' background was filled with incidents that would point toward direct action. Asked to explain this point, Oppenheimer observed incidents in Germany where he had fought street battles against the National Socialists on account of communists, being placed in a concentration camp, escaping by guile. It seemed to me those were past incidents not pointing to temperance. Questioned specifically on his reference to direct action, Dr. Oppenheimer said of Dr. Peters, I think I suggested his attack on the Communist Party as being too constitutional and conciliatory an organization, not sufficiently dedicated to the overthrow of the government by force and violence. Asked the source of his information that Dr. Peters had been a member of the Communist Party in Germany, Dr. Oppenheimer replied, it is well known. Among other things, he told me. Dr. Oppenheimer said he could affirm that there is no connection between his, Peters' work and any application of atomic energy that falls within the jurisdiction of the Atomic Energy Commission. I would believe that if Dr. Peters could teach what he knows to a young man capable of learning it, the country would be better off, because if Dr. Peters cannot be employed by the War Department, at least the young man could be employed by the War Department, end quote. Doctor, are those quotations from the news story I have read you an accurate summary of your testimony? They are fairly accurate. I didn't have the transcript at the time. I believe that a collation was made by Mr. Volpe, who had the transcript to see how accurate they were. In other words, you checked it at the time to see if it was an accurate statement. Somewhat later. It is not a very inaccurate statement. It is substantially accurate, isn't it? I think so. Is there anything in there that you could point to and say that was out of line or inaccurate or incorrect? Not without the transcript, and perhaps not with the transcript. Did you at that time find anything to complain about in the accuracy? No, not in the accuracy. The fact of the publication. Yes, you objected to that. Following the publication of that story, did you hear from Dr. Peters? I did. How did you hear from him? He wrote me. I was on the way west, and I learned that he had called my office at Princeton, and my secretary reported to me what was bothering him. When I got to Berkeley, there was a letter from him. What did he say? He said that he was appalled, and how could I have done him such harm? I don't remember the words of the letter. How long after you appeared and testified was that? About 2 weeks. Did you hear from anybody else about this story? I did indeed. Who? Professor Hans Bethe, Condon, my brother, Weisskopf, perhaps other people. What did Condon have to say? He said I should not have hurt an innocent and loyal American in that way, that I must take him on at the Institute if he lost his job, that if he lost his job, it would be wholly my doing, that I must try to make restitution, and that he hated to believe that I could have said such a thing, and in an attempt to protect myself. I knew very well if my file were ever made public, it would be a much bigger flap. Was that by way of a letter? Yes, sir. Where was Dr. Condon at that time? In Idaho Springs. What business was it of Condon's that you said about Peters? Mr. Chairman, isn't this a new item of derogatory information that is being produced here? Dr. Oppenheimer brought the name up. I didn't. Not in this connection. Certainly he did. Not as an item of derogatory information. Mr. Chairman, I don't think we have to sift this through such a fine sieve as that. What is the objection, Mr. Garrison? This is a wholly new transaction, it seems to me. I don't know what Mr. Robb is leading up to, but it seems to be embarking on a course of discussion of Dr. Oppenheimer's relations with Dr. Condon. If that is to be regarded as an item of derogatory information, whatever may be said of it, which I don't know, I should think that we should be entitled to some notice of it. I had not gathered, at least up to this point, that the discussion of Dr. Condon was of a derogatory nature. I believe Dr. Oppenheimer mentioned Dr. Condon's name. Do you need to refer at this point to Dr. Condon? I don't mind answering the question unless my counsel tells me not to. I withdraw it. I don't know what business it was of Dr. Condon's except that he was outraged at any harm brought to a scientist. Is that the same Dr. Condon that wrote you about Lomnitz? Yes, sir. And protested his draft deferment? Yes, the same Dr. Condon about whom General Grove spoke this morning. Was Condon still on the project when he wrote about Lomnitz? I don't know. He was cleared for it. He was an employee of Westinghouse, and I don't know his exact status. He was not part of the Los Alamos. Is that the same one as quoted as voicing absolute confidence and loyalty and integrity of Dr. Oppenheimer in the Princeton paper? I would not be the least bit astonished, but I don't know. You received that letter at Berkeley. Right. At the same time, did you see Peters at Berkeley? Peters came to see me. Where did Peters come from? He came from Idaho Springs. He went out with Condon? There was a conference of physicists. I was supposed to go. I could not make it. I went straight to the West Coast. Did your brother go? No. Did Peters come alone? His parents live in Berkeley. What did he say? The general substance was there any way in which I could help him to keep his job at the university? He also said I had misunderstood him about his being a member of the Communist Party in Germany. He worked with the communists. He was not ashamed of it, but he was not actually a member, and nobody could prove he was. He said, quote, "You don't know my views about the American Communist Party," end quote, and I should not have quoted him. You were sure he had told you he had been a member? I felt quite sure. You were sure he had told you he had been a member? But I am not infallible in these things, as is being made very clear in these proceedings. What did you do after you received the letter from Dr. Condon and talked to Dr. Peters? I did a lot of things. I consulted Mr. Volpe over the phone, who accompanied me to these hearings. Who is Mr. Volpe? General Counsel of the Atomic Energy Commission. He had accompanied me to the hearings. I told him of the great disturbance, and I then wrote a letter to the Rochester papers, which you no doubt have, the purpose of which was to undo any injury that I should not have done to Peters. I think I also wrote or communicated with the officials of the university saying that I would be glad to talk to them when I got back. Did you see Dr. Peters at Princeton before you saw him at Berkeley? I believe I did. Did you tell him on that occasion that you had testified, but that God had guided the questions so you didn't hurt him? I certainly didn't. Or anything of that sort? No. Did he come to see you at Princeton? Yes, he did. About what? I don't remember. He had been down to testify before this same committee. I imagine it was in that connection. He came to see you about your testimony and his testimony, didn't he? I'm sure he came to see me in connection with the testimony. And you discussed it? I don't believe I discussed mine. It was in executive session. Did you discuss his? You didn't tell him in substance that God guided the questions, or that fortunately the questions were such that you didn't do him any damage? That would certainly not have been an accurate statement, and I don't remember making it. That you then wrote a letter after you saw Peters and received Dr. Condon's letter to the paper. Yes, sir. And in that letter, you retracted some of the testimony you had given, did you not? Right. I had that letter shown to the committee. Just for the record, I will read the letter. Do you have it there, Mr. Garrison? No, but that is all right. This is a photostat from the Rochester, New York Democratic Chronicle, July 6, 1949. The letter is dated June 30, 1949, headed, quote, Dr. Oppenheimer Explains, Editor, Democrat and Chronicle. Recently, the Democrat and Chronicle published an article based on reports of my testimony before an executive session of the House on Un-American Activities, the House Committee on Un-American Activities, which it seems to me could be damaging to the good name of Dr. Bernard Peters of the University of Rochester. I first knew Dr. Peters about 12 years ago during his student days in California. I knew him not only as a brilliant student, but as a man of strong moral principles and of high ethical standards. During those years, his political views were radical. He expressed them freely, and sometimes I thought without temperance. This seemed to me not unnatural in a man who had suffered as he had at Nazi hands. I have never known Dr. Peters to commit a dishonorable act, nor a disloyal one. Dr. Peters has recently informed me that I was right in believing that in the early days he had participated in the communist movement in Germany, but that I was wrong in believing, as the article stated, that he had ever held a membership in the Communist Party. That he has today no regrets for his actions in Nazi Germany, he himself made clear in his statement that accompanied the publication of this article. From the published article, one might conclude that Dr. Peters had advocated the violent overthrow of the constitutional government of the United States. He has given an eloquent denial of this in his published statement. I believe his statement. As indicated in the article, the questions which were put to me by the House Committee with regard to Dr. Peters arose in part because of reports of discussion between me and the intelligence officers at Los Alamos. These Los Alamos consultations took place in connection with confidential wartime assignments. I wish to make public my profound regret that anything said in the context should have been so misconstrued and so abused that it could damage Dr. Peters and threaten his distinguished future career as a scientist. Beyond this specific issue, there is ground for another, more general and even greater concern. Political opinion, no matter how radical or how freely expressed, does not disqualify a scientist for a high career in science. It does not disqualify him as a teacher of science. It does not impugn his integrity nor his honor. We have seen in other countries criteria of political orthodoxy applied to ruin scientists and to put an end to their work. This has brought with it the attention of science. or the attrition of science. Even more, it has been part of the destruction of freedom of inquiry and of political freedom itself. This is no path to follow for a people determined to stay free. Robert Oppenheimer, Berkeley, California, June 30, 1949. So that last paragraph is interesting. There are many cases that he could be referring to. One that strikes me is one that I think Veritasium may have made a video about this. The case of Lysenko and his opposition in the Soviet Union. Basically, you had, in the early days of the Soviet Union, you had this scientist, Lysenko, who did not believe in evolution via natural selection. He believed in this other theory. I forget who it's named after. It's named after some older philosopher, and is now sometimes called Lysenkoism. But it's basically the idea that like traits that you develop, traits that an organism develops during its lifetime can be inherited by its offspring. So like if you work out every day, then your kids will be born stronger, which is just not true. And so Lysenko and his people, his scientists, basically advocated for this in the Soviet Union and ended up for a while getting, evolution and genetics to be like barred and like taboo in the scientific community. And a bunch of, evolutionary scientists who were, say, trying to breed better crops so that there would be better crop yields, they got, sentenced to gulags and things like that. So that could be what he's referencing here. Just the really ridiculous things that can happen if you start to like go after scientists, like not believing in evolution. So yeah, it was a really interesting case. I'm pretty sure Veritasium made a video about it. So like they wanted to make crops that were like resistant to the cold. And so Lysenko, instead of, selecting the crops that survived the cold the best and hybridizing them and breeding them and artificial selection and whatnot, he would like dip the seeds in ice water before planting them so that they would like inherit the like magical abilities, which is very stupid and led to a lot of famine death in the Soviet Union as well. Lysenkoism definitely contributed to that. So yeah, maybe that's what Oppenheimer had in mind, because I think that's a pretty prominent case that people know about. But he could just be, he's obviously talking in general, like, oh, we shouldn't go after scientists for their political views. But yeah, so anyway, I think he was trying to evoke comparisons to Lysenkoism, because that would sort of be a very compelling contrast for people, like, because in America, it's like, oh, well, we don't like communists. And so by saying, well, you're doing something that the communists did in Russia is probably a good way to convince people. But yeah, 1 second, just gonna take a. Okay. So now, Robb asks, Doctor, is that the letter you sent? It is. How has your remark or testimony been misconstrued or abused? Well, for one thing, they were abused by being made public. This was an executive session. I should not have talked in executive session without thinking what they might do publicly. How had your testimony been misconstrued? It was being misconstrued to mean that he should not keep his job. I had explicitly said that I thought it was good he kept his job. The report of your testimony was accurate, wasn't it? Yes. And you have just told us that this letter was intended at least in part to repudiate that testimony. Is that correct? To repudiate is a little strong. Is it now your testimony, Doctor, that your testimony before the House Committee to which we have referred was not true? No, it is certainly not my testimony that it was not true. As to Peter's membership in the Communist Party in Germany, I have only really his word to go on. I am fairly sure of my initial recollection. I'm very clear of his later denial. I don't think, Doctor, when you testified before the House Committee, you knew for you to say that Dr. Peters told you that he had been a member of the Communist Party was a matter of great seriousness, didn't you? Right? You would not have said that, would you, had you not been absolutely sure it was true? I was convinced it was true, or I would not have said it. Beg pardon? I was convinced it was true. And yet, when Peters came to see you and you received a letter from Dr. Condon, you in effect repudiated that testimony, didn't you? Does it say that I don't believe he was a member of the party? I have just read it to you. I have forgotten. Do you mind if I show it to him? Not at all. I don't say I believe his denial, I just say he denied it. Very well. Isn't the implication of your letter that you were wrong in believing that he had been a member of the party? I think it leaves the matter open. Was it your intention to convey that impression when you wrote the letter? I think the sum total of my intention was not to get this guy fired from the University of Rochester because of intemperate remarks I made before the House Committee. You thought your remarks were intemperate. I think somewhat. You thought the truth was intemperate. I think the phrasing of it was intemperate. Was it intemperate for you to testify, believing it to be true that Peters had told you he had been a member of the Communist Party? No. Wasn't it your intention in writing this letter on June 30 to convey to the public the impression that you had been mistaken in saying that he told you he had been a member of the party? I simply gave his own statement. I know you did, but wasn't it your intention to give the public through the press the impression that you were mistaken? I had no specific intention. When Dr. Condon wrote you about your own file, what do you think he referred to by that? I should think the material before you. Do you think you were being placed under any pressure by either Peters or Condon to retract what you said? No, the real pressure came from people who were not belligerent at all, but who were regretful. Who were they? Betha Weisskopf, my brother. They wrote very, very nice letters saying this guy was suffering for something because I had done it, and he should stay on his job. And you were influenced by that pressure, were you not? Of course I was. Where is Peters now? He is in Tata Institute in Bombay. When did you hear from him last? I had a note from him about physics, just an off-print, about a year ago. Did you help him get that job? No. Did he... Let's see, the man he works for, I didn't help him get the job. I know the man he works for. Who's that? Baba is his last name. Has he any communist connection? No, I don't know. He is an Indian. He is a millionaire. I don't know what he is. Do you hear from Dr. Peters frequently? Very infrequently. I think the communications have been scientific papers and one question because I said he made a mistake and he wanted to know what I meant. I didn't answer it. Mr. Chairman, I have a subject that will take a few minutes. Would the chair want me to continue or would you want to adjourn? It is now 25 minutes past 4, I believe. We usually sit until 4:30. I should like to inquire of Dr. Oppenheimer and counsel what their wishes are. The board is prepared to sit further. Could we take a 3-minute recess? We certainly may, and we are prepared in the interest of moving along to sit further if Dr. Oppenheimer feels up to it. Dr. Oppenheimer is ready to go on for about half an hour. Mr. Chairman, I would just like to direct the board's attention to a clipping I have just been handed from the New York Daily News for Thursday, April 15, 1954. The headline, quote, 2 letters hit Oppenheimer as informer, end quote. This is a news article by Jerry Green of the News Bureau, dated Washington, D.C., April 14. That is yesterday. Quote, the AEC problem for Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer as a security risk tonight focused on two mysterious letters accusing the atomic scientist of turning informer in 1949 to protect himself. The letters bore the name of Dr. Hugh Condon, end quote, and so forth. I know nothing more than to bring this to your attention. What paper is that on? New York Daily News. It is today's paper, but written dateline of yesterday, saying that this problem last night focused on the Condon letters, one of which at least has been the subject of testimony this morning. I read that last night. I wondered about it. They must have been clairvoyant. Could we proceed, Mr. Chairman? Yes. Doctor, I would like to talk with you a bit about, for convenience, what I should call the Kenilworth court incident. Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? I do indeed. You are quite familiar, are you not, with the testimony of Paul Crouch and Mrs. Crouch concerning that episode? I have read it. I have gone over part of it with counsel. I am certainly familiar with its general import. I'm not trying to trap you or anything, but merely trying to save time. If you are familiar with it, I won't need to rehearse it. There may be points that I will be unfamiliar with, but let me raise those. You recall that they testified in substance that they had been present at a closed Communist Party meeting in late July 1941, was it? Right. At a house which you were the leaser at 10 Kenilworth Court, Berkeley, California. Crouch had addressed the meeting, explained the Communist Party line, and I believe they said that Joseph Weinberg was also present. Is that about it? That is at least part of it. The word is... Oh, wait, sorry. So the word is lessee. I said lesser, the lessee. Okay. I believe, Doctor, that the substance of your response in your answer at page 30 is that you were the lessee of the house at that time, but that you were in New Mexico and did not attend such a meeting. Is that correct? That is part of my answer. The rest of it is that I also didn't attend such a meeting at any time. Yes, sir. You state in your answer, I believe, that you attempted to establish your whereabouts with the assistance of counsel, had found you were in New Mexico. Is that correct? I stated that. My answer, I think, we will find the words, as near to July 23 as the central date. That is page 30 and 31. I thought probably that at that time of that meeting, which by then had been fixed by Crouch as approximately July 23rd, my wife and I were away from Berkeley. Shortly after, with the aid of counsel. Is it your testimony now, Doctor, that you did not attend that meeting or any similar meeting at which Crouch made a talk? Yes. A closed meeting of the Communist Party in my house at which people were introduced, at which Crouch talked, I did not attend. At which people were not introduced. Were not introduced. Had you ever attended a closed Communist Party meeting of any kind? I told you of the meeting at my brother's, which was not closed because we were guests, but where everybody else I understood to be a communist. I know of no other. Except for the identity of the speaker, Doctor, was there any substantial difference between the meeting at your brother's, which you described, and the meeting which Crouch described? There was everything different. Crouch described a lecture. No one was introduced. It was at my house. It was to discuss, according to his description, high communist policy. The meeting at my brother's house was a meeting at which people were introduced, at least to some extent, very friendly, and not a lecture. They had literature. There was no talk of literature at the Crouch description. Everybody at this other meeting knew everybody else, except the two visitors who were introduced as visitors. No similarity that I can see. What about the meeting at Louise Branston's house? Was there a speaker there? There was. Who was that? Schneiderman. He was also the speaker at Hakon Chevalier's house, wasn't he? Right. What was the difference between those two meetings and the meeting that Crouch described? Of course, leaving out the fact that Crouch described a meeting at your house, which we know. I had no impression, and I know that the meetings at the Chevaliers and the Branstons were not intended as Communist Party meetings. But at both meetings, both the Chevalier and Branston, you had a talk from a high Communist Party functionary about the Communist Party line, didn't you? Right, absolutely. So at least to that extent, those meetings were similar to the one described by Crouch. Right. And they were both at night in a private home, is that correct? Yes. And the one described by Crouch was at night and in a private house. Yes. I believe you told us that so far as you recall, most everybody at the Branston meeting and the Chevalier meeting was either a communist or a fellow traveler. I said, taking sympathizer in a broad sense, a sympathizer. So that the Branston meeting and the Chevalier meeting and the one described by Crouch were all meetings where a high Communist Party functionary was going to explain and expound the Communist Party line. Is that correct? In that respect, correct. I believe there is a difference because Crouch's description indicates that he was telling the comrades what to do and say. There was none of that quality in these other meetings. You mean Schneiderman didn't tell the comrades anything? He said the party stands for this, the party decides, and so on, as a sort of exposition. Do you have any doubt that any comrade there present would have gathered from what Schneiderman said, what Schneiderman was, what he was supposed to believe and say and do? I can testify that it had no such meaning for me because I was not a comrade. That was not quite my question, Doctor. Would you read my question back to the doctor? Question read by reporter. I have a little doubt. I had more the feeling that this was a public relations show on Schneiderman's part. You thought it was necessary for a Communist Party functionary to engage in public relations with comrades? No, they weren't all comrades. A substantial number of them were, weren't they? I don't know. Doctor, when you first heard about Crouch's testimony before the California Committee, did you immediately deny categorically that you had been present at such a meeting? I first heard about it from the FBI, not from the testimony. When you first heard about it from the FBI, did you immediately categorically say, "No, I was not present"? I said it pretty strongly. It took a long time. The investigators produced more and more detail, and the more detail they produced, the more convinced I was that it had not occurred. Whose investigators? The FBI investigators. I have forgotten their names. You mean it was not until after an investigation had been made? No, the FBI came to see me about this matter before the California testimony. Yes, sir. They started interrogating me. As their account of the details of the meeting, the suggested details of the meeting developed, I became quite clear that it had not occurred. I promised to talk it over with my wife and see if she had any recollection of it, and I saw them a few days later and said by then I was sure it did not occur. It took you a little while to make up your mind whether you had been present or not, didn't it? I didn't know what it was that they were talking about. It did not come out in terms of a closed communist meeting. You probably have the record of the interview, and I don't remember the details, but I remember that it wasn't until the thing had some shape that I knew what they were talking about. As soon as you were told that the question was whether you had been at a closed Communist Party meeting and Paul Crouch had made a talk, I was not told about Paul Crouch. As soon as you were told by anybody that the question was whether or not you had been at a closed Communist Party meeting where somebody had made a talk, did you immediately say, "No, it couldn't have been true. I was not there"? I don't remember. and I don't know that is the form in which the incident occurred in the FBI interview. Was that prior to the time when Crouch testified? Yes, I am sure that as a result of these two interviews with the FBI, I did deny it, but I do not know in what sequence the itemization of this meeting occurred. But doctor, isn't it a fair statement to say that it took you some little time before you finally denied that you had been at such a meeting? I don't, it probably took me some time, but I don't know what the facts withheld from me were until I denied it. This is available to you, but it is not in my memory. I will say one thing. I believe it was late in the interview that I said this didn't happen, but I don't know in what order things occurred. Do you recall telling the agents that you did recall somebody asking you to give us your house for a meeting of young people? I have that in my answer. Do you recall telling the agents that? No, I don't. Do you recall telling that the person who requested such permission could have been Kenneth May, but you didn't recall that it was? Yes, now I recollect. I said that to somebody. Whether it was to the U.S. Attorney or the agents, I don't remember. What I am asking you about is an interview with two special agents of the FBI. Right. I believe at San Francisco. No. Pardon? Wasn't it? Was it at Princeton? If it is the one I'm thinking of, it was at Princeton. Do you recall making that statement about possibly loaning your house to some young people, possibly Kenneth May being involved, making that statement in May 1952 to perhaps the U.S. Attorney's Office here? Yes, in fact, I say that in my answer. Did you categorically deny ever having been at such a meeting, Doctor, until after you or your representatives had made the investigation in New Mexico? I categorically denied it to the FBI in these two interviews. Doctor, your position is that you could not have been there because you were in New Mexico, is that right? No, my position is a little more complicated than that. It is first that I recollect nothing about it, and that the circumstances are such that I don't believe I could fail to recollect it. It is second that if I were there, it could not have been a closed meeting of the Communist Party because I wasn't. It is third that at the time it is alleged to have occurred, and for a considerable time before and after that, we were not there. The first point is important. I forget a lot, but the notion that I would forget a meeting in my own home at which a lecture has been given, I think that has never happened, is a little hard. The notion that I would forget a meeting in my own home filled with people at which no one was introduced is a little hard. Doctor, you purchased your house at One Eagle Hill there from Mrs. Damon. I did. Those negotiations were going on during July of 1941, weren't they? Yes. Do you recall meeting with Mrs. Damon at Berkeley to divide up some furniture that was in the house? Yes. In the new house? Yes. Do you recall when that was? Not with precision, but I should think the 8th of August was a pretty good guess. 10th of August, maybe. I'm not sure. Did you go back to New Mexico after that happened? No. Did you stay in Berkeley? We stayed in Berkeley. It would have been physically possible for you to fly back from New Mexico for a day or two to Berkeley and then return, would it not? Of course it would. It would not have taken you very long to get back from New Mexico. No, especially for an important communist meeting. But your testimony is that you didn't do that. That's right. I think that brings that item to a close. Do you have one other line of questioning? It will take quite a while. It is not yet 5. Maybe I can ask 2 or 3 miscellaneous questions, if I may. Is there just one other major line of questioning? I think so, Doctor, but don't hold me to that. I was interested a while ago, and I suppose this is more curiosity than anything, when you referred to being accompanied by counsel to the House Un-American Activities Committee, you mentioned Mr. Volpe. That's right. and identified him as general counsel. Right. Was he at that time general counsel? He was, and I was chairman of the General Advisory Committee. It was in that capacity. I think the commission agreed or decided that this was a proper arrangement. I don't know whether you know the answer to this question, Dr. Oppenheimer, but in reading the files, there appear references to closed meetings of the Communist Party. There also appear many references to meetings of people who were communists or fellow travelers, which were referred to as social gatherings. Without implying that you are an expert in these matters, but from conversations with your brother, perhaps, or Mrs. Oppenheimer and others, is there any real difference between a closed meeting and a social gathering if the same people are involved? Let me tell you by what I mean by those words. The words closed meeting mean to me one to which only members of the Communist Party can come. I think that is a rather sharp distinction if you are trying to identify who is and who isn't a member of the Communist Party. I should suppose that the difference between a meeting and a social gathering was rather wide. In a meeting, it was business and it was transacted, and there was probably a chairman, and there might be dues collected, and there might be literature. Anyway, this happened at the little meeting I saw at my brother's. I should think that a social gathering would be a lot of talk, which could indeed be very bad talk, but which would not be organized or programmatic. This is the sense in which I would interpret the words. So these two meetings, which have been the subject of some discussion, at both of which I believe Mr. Schneiderman spoke, in the terms of the definitions which you have given, they would really have been social gatherings. I would say they were neither. They were social gatherings ornamented by a special feature, namely this lecture or speech. An ordinary social gathering, I don't think, has a lecture even in communist jargon. I just had the impression about these functions that many of those that we referred to were social gatherings may have been meetings. That doesn't concern your attendance at all. There is one question I have which relates to the security of the project itself. Very early on in your testimony, in some discussion about the procedures or security measures which were taken after very careful thought, you made the observation, obviously, they did not succeed. Again, this is not a direct quote. Do you mind amplifying on that just a moment? Yes, I think of the known leakages of information, Fuchs is by far the most grave. It occurred out of Los Alamos. I won't attempt to assess responsibility for the surveillance of personnel and moved around of personnel who moved around there. Facilities for surveillance were available, and they could well have been used in following Fuchs rather than somebody else. That would not have prevented his prior espionage, but it would have prevented the espionage at that time. I can't imagine any more pinpointed leakage than if Fuchs had simply communicated what he was working on. I don't mean that this was the only secret, but I can't imagine any single little point that would be more helpful to an enemy than the job he had himself. While not wishing to debate with General Groves either the necessity, the desirability, or the dangers of compartmentalization, I would like to record that if Fuchs had been infinitely compartmentalized, what was inside his compartment would have done the damage. Here is a rather sharp change of pace again. Do you know what was the source of the allegation that you caused to be circulated the GAC report at Los Alamos? No, I would very much like to know the source of it. I have a conjecture, but I would prefer to be told and not to make the conjecture. Might I ask this one question, Mr. Chairman, suggested by a question that you asked? Yes. Dr. Oppenheimer, when did you tell the FBI about this meeting at Louis Branston's house? I spoke of that earlier. I said at the latest 1952 and possibly earlier. I don't remember. At one of the interviews that we have talked about, either in 1946, 50, or 52, is that right? Yes, in 1952, I think it possible that it was an interview with my wife at which I was present. You think that is when you told them about it? I know that it occurred not later than that interview. Have you been interviewed since 1952? Only minor ones, not protracted ones. Again, a shift of subject, and you may have answered a question about this, Dr. Oppenheimer. I am sure you testified that your brother Frank had told you that he joined the Communist Party. Yes. Were you questioned about your knowledge about his severing connection with the Communist Party? I don't want to plow over some old ground. Was I questioned here? I think I was. I think it is in the transcript. As to the facts, I felt assured by talking to him in the fall of 1941 he was no longer a member. Whether that is because I asked him or because he told me, yes, I do remember. That was covered. Were you also asked about Mrs. Frank Oppenheimer? Did she follow the same course? I understood this went for both of them, but perhaps not quite so sharply. One other unrelated question. We talked yesterday about your having dinner or at least a social visit with Dr. Chevalier in Paris in November or December. There was in the morning press statement attributed to Dr. Chevalier. There was in the morning press a statement attributed to Dr. Chevalier, which had a St. Louis dateline, I believe. Yes, which indicated to me that he is in this country. Were you aware of that fact that he was back in this country? No, in fact, I am skeptical of it. I gather you are saying that you have no reason to believe that he is not still in Paris. That's right. I don't want to clutter up the record with the quotes of Dr. Chevalier, but am I right in thinking I read that in today's press? You are correct. It is now a couple of minutes after 5. We will meet at 9 in the morning, and you will proceed with the questioning. Thereupon, at 5:03 p.m., a recess was taken until Friday, April 16, 1954, at 9 a.m. Awesome. So, that completes this 4th day of the hearing. Give me 1 second to take a drink of water. So that was interesting. Getting very close to the end of Robb's cross-examination, and once that's done, it's mostly going to be the series of witnesses coming through. And that's going to be really interesting. I think the witnesses have been really interesting so far. Um, and yeah, I'll admit, even to me, the cross-examination is getting a little slow, a little repetitive. And I think that's just because of what Mr. Garrison was pointing out here, which is that, you're asking Oppenheimer questions. This transcript takes place in 1954, and these questions are asking about things like, oh, did you meet with this person in 1941 or 1943 or 46? And it's like kind of hard to remember those things from so long ago. I mean, that would be like asking you about like, oh, did you meet with so and so in 2012? Or did you have lunch with this person in 2016? Like, it's such a long time ago that it would be hard to remember a lot of these things, especially the exact words you said during a conversation. Like, oh, you talked to so and so on, July 19th, 2011. Do you remember talking about, you know, blah, blah, blah? Like, I feel like most of us, if asked that, would have trouble remembering that. And so, really, the whole point of this is just to submit the transcripts of these conversations to the record. But Robb is sort of putting on this pretense of fairness by saying, well, I could just hand over the records, but I'm actually being very generous by asking you about the transcripts first and then handing it over. So, yeah, but really, I think the point of this is just to get those transcripts on the record of his various conversations and testimonies and things like that. Um, oh yeah, let me switch this. But yeah, so I think it's very interesting, and I think it's going to get more interesting with the next hearing. So yeah, uh, unless anyone watching has a quick question for me in the chat, I think that's where I'm going to leave it off today. So yeah, thank you all for watching. All right, looks like there's no chat, so I'm gonna leave it here. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next week.